Colossians chapter 3 once again. Did you know that your body eats itself? The process is called autophagy, which is a Greek word which means eats itself. In 2016, a guy named Yoshinori Asumi won the Nobel Prize for research on autophagy. He found that human cells will wrap defective organelles and proteins in a protective shield of lipids and then shred them to pieces with enzymes. Scientists previously thought that cells were all about saving proteins, not destroying them. So in orthodox cellular biology, the body's ability to build proteins, not demolish them, was considered the key to health. When he saw cells taking an enzymatic wrecking ball to their own proteins, he was shocked. But what he discovered is that this demolition process is crucial to your body's health. Cells routinely, this happens all the time, put to death broken proteins and malfunctioning organelles, the ones that use up the body's energy without giving anything in return, and then recycle those broken pieces into new proteins and organelles that work like they're supposed to. Asumi realized that if the body were to stop this process, it would begin to fail. For the last 2 weeks, we have been thinking about how to move closer to your truer, fuller self, which is constructed on a blueprint, or an image in St. Paul's terminology, an image of God. But as we saw last week, to get closer to that true self, we need to move away from the false, malfunctioning self. That process is a kind of spiritual autophagy. The old is put to death, but the energies that made it function are renewed, that's verse 10, recycled, you could say, into the emerging true self. You can't move forward in this renewal process without putting to death, that was verse 5, the broken members of what Paul called the old person. In verse 9, Paul says, "Do not lie to each other, since you've taken off your old self with its practices." Those practices, including deception, lust, anger, are a shield that protects the false self and prevents the new Christ-like one from replacing it. But you, Paul says, you who are believers, have taken off that old person, and you did that when you trusted Christ. You said goodbye to your old life. I'm walking away from this life. And you expressed that in your baptism. And verse 10, you have put on the new self. You expressed that in baptism as well. And now you're experiencing it, that new self, in everyday life. Paul says that this new self is being renewed in knowledge and the image of its creator. At the center of that renewal process is the putting off of the old self with its practices and the putting on of the new with its practices. You can't put on the new without taking off the old any more than you can put on a new pair of shoes while you're wearing your old ones. Every time you take something off that belongs to the old self, you are creating the opportunity for the new self to emerge. That's the way this works. So with that in mind, let me read what Paul says next. So I'll begin with verse 12 and read down through verse 14. Therefore, and that is, since you are being renewed, you're being recycled into that new person in Christ, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Paul tells us to clothe ourselves with 5 virtues. So here is what the well-dressed Christian is wearing. But what does that mean? What does it mean to clothe yourself with a virtue? How do we do that? When you put on a piece of clothing, so a hat, a shirt, pants, you realize that that's not a natural part of you. You had it to keep your head warm if it's a hat, to avoid being arrested if it's your pants. Likewise, when you start putting on virtues, like the ones we read about in verse 12, you realize that they're not a natural part of you. They certainly don't fit. You may even think, this isn't really me, and feel like a hypocrite. Don't let that feeling keep you from doing it. It is only hypocritical if you're doing it to manage people's perceptions. It is not hypocritical if you're doing it to obey Christ, doing it for another person's good, or doing it in order to become a better person. That's not hypocritical. That's Christian. If I act compassionately toward you in order to make you or the people around you think that I'm better than I really am, that's hypocrisy. If I act compassionately toward you because God commands me to do that, or simply because I want to be a better person, that's not hypocrisy. It's not the absence of feelings that makes a person a hypocrite. It's the practice of deception. Deception for the sake of self-promotion. Not only is putting on a virtue not hypocrisy, it is essential to moving closer to your true self. And you need to know when you put these things on, they're not going to feel natural to you at first. Putting on virtues is a part of transformation. Metamorphosis, that's St. Paul's word. And in some ways, it's like putting on an article of clothing, but in some ways, it's not like that at all. A piece of clothing doesn't become part of you. Though I once had a sweater with these leather elbow patches that came really close to being a part of me, especially in the wintertime. If you put on a virtue again and again, it grows into your soul. A person who puts on compassion, not to deceive others, but to obey Christ, and does that repeatedly, will become compassionate. Do it often enough, and the compassion you put on the outside will grow into you. It's like something out of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it's not the result of some freak accident. It is built into humans by design. And by the way, that same capacity comes into play with the anti-virtues in verse 5 and verse 8. So if you take up anger, if you wear it again and again, it will grow into your soul and become part of you. The same with malice and deceit and so on. Humans were designed this way. They were made with the capacity to transform into something the Marvel Cinematic Universe never even imagined. Something can be astonishingly good and beautiful, or hideously bad and ugly. Now, verse 12, we are to put on, clothe ourselves with, that's how the NIV puts it, compassion. Compassion is a bridge into a foreign land, the foreign land of another person's life. Through compassion, we enter that person's fear, loss, heartache, discouragement. Even when they've brought all those things on themselves, we want them to come through, to be all right. We want them to do well. Compassion is the bridge that brought Jesus into your life, and it will bring you into the life of others. It is one of God's own virtues. He's the Father of compassion. And when we put on compassion, we are children dressing up in Father's clothes. And they're not going to fit for a while. Besides compassion, we are to put on kindness. This, too, is a word the Bible uses to describe God. Kindness has to do with your regard for another person's feelings. God regards, believe it or not, our feelings. The next virtue is humility. The Greek word makes it clear that this has something to do with how we think. The King James actually translates this as humbleness of mind. In the first century, non-Christians, I'm thinking of moralists and philosophers, despised humility as a vice, not a virtue. They considered humility a weakness, a defect. Only Christians valued humility. Now, it's really important that we understand what humility is and what it isn't. Humility is not gauged by what you think of yourself. So thinking, I am so useless. Everybody's better than me. I don't deserve anything. That doesn't make a person humble. You can think all those things and be positively bursting with pride. The difference between humility and pride is that pride looks or thinks in, but humility looks, thinks out. Humility doesn't say, I'm nobody. It says, everybody's somebody. Whether a proud person boasts about or disparages himself makes little difference. In practice, it makes no difference at all. Either way, he's caught in his own orbit. And it's a degrading orbit. He's going to sooner or later crash into himself. But the humble person's life orbits around God and does so in the company of others. Humility is a foundational virtue. Compassion, kindness, they're built on humility. When we put on humility, we are acting like the one who, being in very nature God, this is Philippians chapter 2, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped onto. I'm keeping this for myself, but emptied himself. See, Jesus was not humble, even though he was in very nature God. Let me try that again. Jesus was not humble, even though he was in very nature God. He was humble because he was in very nature God. God is humble. Gentleness is the next virtue. Sometimes it's translated as meekness. Gentleness is often mistaken for weakness. It is not. It is strength, but it's strength under control. And because of that, gentleness feels safe. Gentleness is not a thing you do. It's the way you do your thing. Two people can do the same thing, say the same words, but in different ways, one with gentleness and one without. The gentle person will be mindful of others. The ungentle person will be mindful of a goal. The next virtue, still in verse 12, is patience. There are two Greek words translated patience in the New Testament. This one refers to patience with people rather than patience with circumstances. That's the other word. Instead of demanding change, patience gives people room to change. And the patient person can do that because he trusts that God is involved. He believes that God's already working in this person. He doesn't have to be the one who makes everything come out right. He knows that God will do that. So think of patience as having two sides. One side is turned toward the difficult person. I say that as I point right at Elijah. One side's pointed towards the difficult person, the person we want to change. The other is turned toward God, whom we want to do the changing. When we lack patience with people, it probably means that we lack patience with God. And when we lack patience with God, we always try to do his job for him. We go back to Eden and eat the forbidden fruit all over again. When you put on the virtues of verse 12, you're going to find yourself in the life space of verse 13, where you bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. In real life, there are always going to be things about people that bother us. They have their idiosyncrasies and foibles and quirks. They don't do things the right way, by which, of course, I mean they don't do things my way. We are, Paul tells us, to bear with, or better yet, put up with such things. When done right, this is really helpful to understand. When done right, putting up with people is a powerful spiritual discipline. The things that irritate us become opportunities to put off and put to death that false self. Now, those kind of irritations are a mercy, but they're a severe mercy. Every time you find yourself irritated by someone's foibles or quirks or idiosyncrasies, every time you're annoyed that they're doing it the wrong way, turn to God. Recognize what's happening. Turn to God. Decisively put off that old self and put up with the person. The better you get at putting on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, the more natural it will be for you to put up with people. So, you put up with quirks and idiosyncrasies and foibles, all those things that annoy you. You don't put up with sins. You forgive them. It's important to make that distinction. You don't put up with sins. You forgive sins. There are a couple words in the New Testament that are translated forgive, and each connotes a different aspect of forgiveness. One focuses on the sin and has the idea of sending that sin away. The other, which is the one that we have in this verse, focuses on the sinner and has the idea of showing the sinner grace. The sin is sent away. The sinner is graced, just as the Lord graced us. In fact, the word that we have here in Greek is the verb. It's the word grace in a kind of verbal form. We're gracing people. The old broken self will get this wrong every time. Rather than sending away the sin, it embraces it. It holds it tight. It never forgets it. But it sends the sinner away. It snubs and ignores and refuses to have anything to do with him. It clings to the sin, replays it 1,000 times, but it pushes the sinner away. That is a well-worn path. The whole world follows that path. But it will not lead you closer to your true self. It leads to a wilderness of self-righteousness and anger and eventually despair. If humility is the foundation of virtues, love is the capstone. It's what binds them all together. So a capstone locks other stones in place and makes it possible for them to bear great weight. That's what love does for the virtues of verse 12. It holds them together. It makes it possible for them to bear up under the crushing weight of annoyance and sin. But love doesn't originate in you. Love comes from God. Let me paint two scenarios for you. In the first, you're a POW. You're a prisoner of war in a Nazi stalag at the end of World War II. A couple days ago, when the Allied advance reached Ansbach, the guards abandoned their posts and fled. They ran away, taking all the food and water with them. It's now been 3 days since you've eaten. You and another prisoner climb the guard tower. Everything's abandoned. You climb the guard tower to have a look around. You enter, but he, exhausted by the climb, sits and rests on one of the steps outside. And so you see what he doesn't see. In the corner of that tower, under an old coat, someone has left a sandwich and a canteen of water. Just then you hear him outside say, "I feel like I'm going to pass out." What do? You feel terrible too. If the Allies don't liberate this camp soon, that sandwich and canteen might mean the difference between life and death. So do you give it to your fellow prisoner, or do you hide it and you keep it for yourself? All right, second scenario is similar. You see the canteen and the sandwich, your fellow prisoner does not, but in this scenario, you also see a long line of American Army vehicles coming up the road. They'll be here in minutes. Now, do you give some of the water and sandwich to your fellow prisoner? I suspect you might be far more generous in the second scenario than in the first. And it wouldn't be because you were suddenly a better person, but you saw that you were going to have all that you needed and more. That's the way it is with God's love. When you see that you are loved with a love that has no end, you're free to give love to others. But when you don't see that, you're afraid to love. That's why it's so important, 1 John chapter 4, verse 16, that we have come to know and to trust, literal translation, the love that God has in us. We trust it's not going to run out. He's going to love us and love through us. All right, let me wrap this up. Don't forget, you move closer to your truer, fuller self as you move closer to the Lord. That's the trailhead. That's where this journey begins. Remember, too, that you must leave behind the practices of that false, malfunctioning self. They need to be put to death. They need to be put off. When they show up in your life, and they show up in all our lives, every one of us has been damaged by Adam's fall and by our own sins. When they show up, don't despair. Seize the occasion. Every time you put off some broken piece of the old self, an opportunity opens up to put on the new self, to become what you have not yet been. Don't waste time beating up the old self. Instead, put it to death, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. That's verse 5. And then put on the virtues of verse 12. You may feel hypocritical when you do this. Do it anyway. Now, you can't put them on without taking something off, just like you can't put on a new pair of shoes while you're still wearing your old ones. Intentionally take off the practices of the old self, ask God for help, and then choose to act compassionately, kindly, humbly, gently, with patience. Act that way even when you don't feel like it, which frankly is going to be most of the time in the beginning. It is only hypocrisy if you're trying to deceive someone. Remember the conflicts with other Christians. So I'm talking about spouses, children, parents, church members, friends. Those conflicts provide the opportunity to do this. When, not if, but when a conflict arises, go to God first, get close to Him. That's where you're going to find the ability to put on these virtues. If it's an annoyance, put up with it. Don't call it a sin. That's something that just annoys you, understandably, but it's not a sin. If it's a sin, send away the sin, but grace the person with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. If you have been doing just the opposite, holding the sin close and sending the sinner away, you are delaying the development of the true self. You need to send away the sin, but grace the sinner. If you are having trouble with that, and who has not had trouble with that? We have a booklet. Many of you have already seen this booklet and have taken it on forgiveness that might help you. If after you've read that booklet you are still having trouble forgiving, call me. And let's set up a time when we can talk. We're going to think about how this works in real life at Go Deep on Wednesday at 6:30, right across the hall here. Consider coming and joining us while we talk through this and what it means. But this is the last word. Whatever else you do, don't let what someone did to you in the past prevent you from becoming the strong, joyous person God intends you to be in the future. Did you hear that? Okay, let's pray.